Hello everyone. Earlier today I saw this tutorial on Traverse Media's channel about building a real-time chat app using React and AppWrite. If you're not familiar, AppWrite's a alternative to something like Firebase where it's a backend as a service. So it's really good if you need something like that. But it did get me thinking, how quickly could we build something using Ruby on Rails? Now I have my demo here that I got. It looks similar-ish. Of course, I don't care about styling as much as other people do. So in my tutorials, it's usually not as pretty as the one that's going on in Traverse's tutorial. Because as you can see here, this one looks absolutely beautiful, regardless of what they might think of their own CSS abilities. Mine, not so much. But it took me about 27 minutes to throw this together. Now I want to see how quickly I can throw this together while I talk you through it. Now again, I'm doing this as a speed run. It's just for fun. It's not competitive against, this 2-hour time because they actually, teach you how to do it. But in my speedruns, I tend to go through things quickly and I don't explain them fully. I also copy paste some code. So don't expect like a full featured tutorial on all things turbo and stimulus. But that said, hopefully you'll at least get something out of this to at least enjoy whatever you're watching. So to get started, I'm going to CD out of here and do a Rails new video with a -J of ESBuild, a -C of Tailwind. So I'm using Tailwind for this. I'll CD into the video project and I'll run a code dot. Okay, so that took about 45 seconds. That's fine though. Let's go ahead and let's get started. Now, tools we're going to be using, we're going to be using Devise and Faker. Devise for user accounts, Faker for creating test data. We're then going to go ahead and run a railsg devise :install command to install Devise for our user accounts. We'll run railsg devise user to create a user model. We'll then go ahead and run a railsg migration, add username to users with a username of type string, which is unique. We can then go ahead and run a railsg model message with a body text user : references. That just means that in our app models user.rb, we need to tell the user that it has many messages, and we'll say these are dependent : destroy. So let's do that. Next, let's come back into our terminal. We're not done yet. We need to run a railsg controller messages to create our messages controller. We can then go ahead and create our railsg controller pages home to create our home page. We can then go ahead and run a railsdb : migrate because we're done setting up the database. Now we're going to be using stimulus for 3 pieces of functionality. One is for the chat. The chat is going to handle when you receive a message, it has to scroll you down to the bottom of the message container. Or when you send a message, of course, because the message gets added and then it has to scroll down. It also has to, when you receive a message, determine if it's from you or if it's from someone that sent a message to you. If it's from you, it'll highlight the background with your color. If it's from someone that sent a message, so you're receiving it, then you'll see their name or their text with just a border instead. So that's what the chat controller is going to handle. We're then also going to have another one, which is just going to be a railsg stimulus reset form. This is after you type a message and send it, it's going to clear this form. So that's why we call it reset form. So we want both of those. Next, let's come into our DB and our seeds file. Inside of our DB seeds, we're going to do something that's a little bit ugly, but we're going to do a set of 3 users. We create a Dean, a John, and a Jane. Then we do a bit of message seeding. So we say, all right, we have 50.timesDo, message.create with a body and a user ID that is random. Go ahead and save that, run a railsdb : seed command to seed our database. Okay, so now we basically just have to set up this application. So the first thing we're going to do is come into our Tailwind and our config. The reason is we're going to be using a couple of changes to the theme. We're going to give it a theme, extend the colors, give it a theme color main and a theme color secondary. We do this because in the source for that other tutorial from Traverse Media's channel, they have a bunch of CSS. Now I'm lazy, so I didn't use all of these, but I tried to keep in line with the idea of a theme color main and a theme color secondary. So that's what these two are for. We can then come up to our assets and our style sheets and our application.tailwind.whatever. Because inside of this, we can once again set the same type of thing. So this is what the colors actually look like, because I wanted to show you what I'm using here. This is for the delete button. This is for the actual text outlines. And then we just set the background to be a blackish color and the font to be a whitish color. Not the best practice to apply it to everything, but again, I really don't care, so we'll just go with that. Okay, so that takes care of styling the application. That takes care of the gem files. Let's come into our routes. Inside of our routes, there's a couple things we have to do. We have to create the resources for our messages, just like that. We want to set the root of our application to be the pages controller home action. Then we want to set the Devise controllers to use the registrations, users registrations controller. Now, I think we still have to create that. So let's go ahead and let's do a Rails G Devise. And we want to use a Rails G Devise :views to generate our Devise views. And then a Rails G Devise :controllers for the users. The views are so we can add the username to the edit and sign up pages. And the registrations controller is because we have to come into our app, our controllers, our users, and our registrations controller. We have to edit this a little bit. Whenever you want to add a new field to Devise, you have to tell it if you want to be able to use it for sign up or for account update. In my case, I want to use it for both. So we have to add both of those to the top there. And then we have to uncomment both the configure update and configure sign up to use the username. This now allows you to actually submit the username to your database, but we still need to edit the form to do that. To do that, we can come into our views, our Devise, our registrations, and our edit page for our registrations. The edit page is pretty simple. We're just going to come below the email confirmation and add a field for the username. So it has a label of username and a text field of username. You can then come into the new page. And if you're creating a new account, we'll do the same thing. You enter your email, then you'll enter your username, and then you'll enter your password stuff. That takes care of the Devise setup. So we can go ahead and close all of that. We're pretty much done with that now. Okay, so now what we want to do is actually deal with the home page. So once you get to the home page, what do you want to do? In the app pages home.html.erb, we're going to go ahead and delete this, and we're going to paste in this. The first bit here is important. This turbo stream from the current user is because we don't want to give every user the delete button for our messages. We only want this to go to the user who sent a message. So we stream that specifically to this channel, which is just DOM ID of current_user, which is going to be translated to user underscore and then the ID of that user. That's what this DOM ID does. It takes this model and then it adds an underscore and then it adds the ID of the thing. So in my case, this would be user_1 because I'm going to be logged in as the first user. We then use some Tailwind classes here to style some stuff to give it the text at the top that says chat room. We then have the welcome current user .username, which is how we get this welcome Dean. Then we have our div ID for the chat box, where we pass in a partial for the messages/chat box. We have a bunch of CSS classes and we pass in the messages to that. Then we have the form below that. So this is our chat box. This is our form right here. That's how our home page is set up. So now we have two sets of partials we have to create inside of our messages. Right click, new file in messages _chatbox.html.erb. Inside of our chatbox.html.erb. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to step through all of this front end nonsense. Then we'll deal with the JavaScript, or then we'll deal with the model, and then we'll deal with the stimulus controller. Sorry. Inside of the chat box, we turbo stream from messages because this is where we're going to be saying, hey, you have a new message. You have to add it somewhere on this page. So we turbo stream from the messages channel, and then we have a div with an ID of messages right here. So we're going to say, send this to the messages channel, target the messages div, pass in a new message. The actual scrolling down and all of that will be handled by our stimulus controllers. For that, we tell this div right here to have the chat controller on it. Remember, this is the thing that's going to be listening for new messages. And we also tell the chat controller that it has a value for the current user ID, which we set to the current user ID. We have to do this because we can't set the background of the message for a specific user with Turbo, because Turbo doesn't let you use current user inside of Turbo frame tags. It completely blows up. It doesn't like it, so you don't have access to that, which makes sense. The message model can't broadcast to the current user because it doesn't know who the current user is when it's saving a message, and then it broadcasts that out to just whatever channel you say. There's no way for it to know who's logged in or anything. So we have to work around that. So anytime we go into the turbo frame right here with the message partial, we have to do any sort of checks for current user stuff outside of it. And we have to make sure that when we're doing stuff like changing the message based on who the user is or adding delete buttons and stuff like that, we usually have to use stimulus, or we have to do some clever workaround like we're doing here. So we have this message partial. We pass in this display controls. The reason why we do this is because inside of this message partial underscore message.html.urb, we filter out the controls. We have a DOM ID for our message, which again, just to remind you, is going to give us message underscore 1 for the first message, etc. In here, we have our actual messages with our username, our created at. Then we have a turbo frame tag for a array of stuff. This just gets translated to message underscore 1 because it's the DOM ID. And then the array just adds each element or appends them with a underscore and then whatever it has. So this will become message underscore ID underscore controls. So inside of this turbo frame tag, if display controls is true, which it will be when you, if you're the current user and you're loading this page for the first time, then we want to display these message controls, which will be our delete button. So we'll come into our messages folder, right click new file, underscore controls.html.urb. And inside of this controls partial, we just say, here's your link to delete, method of delete, and a data turbo method delete inside of that as well with some Tailwind styling. So let's come back to here. We can see that this will only render the controls if you are on the initial page load. Otherwise, it will not display these. But we keep the turbo frame here because if we send a message to everyone, we then want to send these controls. So what we do is we send the message to everyone. Then for the user whose ID matches the current user's ID, we then broadcast the display controls. And we can do that because we can just broadcast to the message.user.ids channel, which will go to the same one as the current user if they are the same user. A little bit confusing, but that's just kind of the workaround I've figured out for this. And that allows us to actually add the delete button. We can then say, all right, message body at the bottom here, and then we're done with that. Let's come back to the home page because we finished the chat box, but now we have the messages form. Now this form is pretty simple. We come into the messages, right click new file, underscore form.html.urb. Inside of this form, let me copy paste it. Please don't cry. It's a lot of stuff, but it's not that bad. We say this has a model for the message, an ID of message form, a method of post, all standard stuff. We tell it the stimulus controller is a reset-form. Makes sense. We're using the reset form to reset this form. We give it an action on a turbo submit end. So once you submit this form, which is the same thing as saying I've clicked send or I've hit enter to send the message, we then want to call the reset form stimulus controller clear input action. That stimulus controller will also have a reset form target on the actual input. So that's this input right here is what we're resetting. So we give it this target so we can then call this element dot value equals empty to clear this of whatever text is in there. So that's sort of what we're going for there. The rest of this is pretty standard stuff. It's just Tailwind makes it look disgusting. And then right here we have the form button. This is for our little paper airplane submit button. So we have a form.button with a bunch of classes. Inside of that, we have this paper airplane icon that ChatGPT made for me. Then we have the end for this form button, and then we have the end for the form. That's the entire form right there. Okay, so that takes care of the front end effectively, aside from like the JavaScript. Now what I want to do is I want to come into our controllers up here and come into the pages controller. Pages controller is important because on initial page load, we have to do two things. Actually, I guess technically three things. We want to start with a authenticate user, so we don't even have to deal with users not being signed in. We then want to say grab the last 5 messages, and then we want to do a current user.messages.build. Pretty standard stuff there. Just gives us a @message to pass into our form and messages to show on the page on initial load, which is why there's only 5 showing up here. You can just get rid of this and change it to a .all if you want to see all messages. Okay, now let's come into our messages controller. In the messages controller, there's 2 things we want to set up. First, we want to do another before action to authenticate user. And then at the bottom, we want to do a private section for a message params with a require on the message and a permit for the body. And we want to set the message, which is just message.find by the params ID. We only find a message for the destroy action because you can't find a message for the create action. That wouldn't make any sense. You're not finding one, you're creating one. For the create action, we say current user.messages.build. Because we're signed in, we can use current user, which just builds a new message and sets its user ID to be the current user's ID. You then call message.save. For the destroy, we can come down here, do a def destroy. Oops, def destroy. And In here, what we want to do is say if, we want to come in here and we just want to do something like at message.destroy. Okay, so that takes care of that. You could also do better checks in here where you check if the current user equals whatever. It's not that complicated. I just chose to omit that, but that gives you your destroy action here. Now, you'll notice we're not doing anything. So these just call, save, and destroy. There's no redirect or anything. And the reason for that is because all of that logic is handled in our model, inside of our message model to be specific. This is where a lot of the magic happens. The message model does a couple things. It starts by validating the length of the input. Reason why is because in this tutorial, they set the length to be 1000 characters. So I thought, why not? Let's do the same thing. We then have two different after create calls. One is to broadcast a create and one is to broadcast a destroy. Let's start with the destroy because it's simple. Broadcast destroy, broadcast a remove to the messages channel. Goes to the messages channel. And then it says, all right, you're streaming from messages. Inside of the div with an ID of messages, I want you to remove this message that has this ID. Rails does that whole this message with this ID part by itself, just figures it out. So all you need to know is this ID right here needs to be the same. It'll go in here, it'll find the appropriate message, and it'll delete that HTML from the page so you don't have to do anything. For the create, that's where we had to get a little bit creative, no pun intended, although it is appreciated. We broadcast two different things when we create a message. The first is we broadcast a new message where we pass in this message with its own contents, and we tell it display controls is false because we don't know who the current user is. So we just say don't display the controls, only display that turbo frame tag right here. So this is effectively out of here. It's just an empty bit. Then, after we've broadcasted that message partial to the messages channel, we then want to broadcast an additional thing to the user underscore and then the user ID of this message's user. So this right here is set actually on our homepage. That is this turbo stream from right here. Because it's all the way out here, we can set the current user in here. And now we know we're only broadcasting to that specific user. So we can broadcast to the turbo frame tag that has the message controls, the delete button in it. And then we can pass in the message controls partial, where we only have to pass in a message. So that's how we get the delete button to appear, even though we can't use current user with turbo. Okay, so that's that. Now for the complicated part. It's time for the JavaScript. We're gonna come into our app, our JavaScript, our controllers. We'll start with the reset form controller because it's the easiest one to understand. I'm gonna go ahead and copy and paste the whole thing in, but don't worry, you'll get to cry for the next one. This just has a static targets for the input. That is the input that we're actually typing into right here. Remember, we gave that an input. Then we have a clear input that just says this.inputTarget.value equals empty string. Cool. That's all of it for the reset form controller. Now let's come over to the chat controller. This is where you're probably going to want to flame me in the comments. I'm sorry, but eventually you do have to use some JavaScript. For this, we give it one set of values, which is the current user ID, which we set up in the initial chat box right here. That's how we grab that current user ID. Then we have to set up a couple of listeners. One is going to be for the scroll listener and one is going to be for the message listener. Because we're setting these up in the connect method, I also want to disconnect them in the disconnect method. It's just good practice. Make sure that you clean up after yourself. Next, we're going to set up the listeners. Now, these are both going to be similar. I'm going to try and walk through this. We start with a setup scroll listener where we call scroll to bottom, which we'll take a look at in a minute here. Then we create the scroll observer, which is a new mutation observer, which just looks for changes. And when it detects a change, it calls this.scroll to bottom. So it scrolls to bottom initially when the page loads because we call it in connect. And then anytime something changes, it'll scroll to the bottom. Down here, we then say this.scroll observer, observe this element for any changes in the children or the subtree. So it's observing this and it's looking for changes in any of these of this is the basic way you can look at this. And because I've just explained that, we can now go ahead and just do the exact same thing right here for a message listener. So now we have a style existing messages that gets called initially, because when the page initially loads, it has to style the messages from me with a blue background and the messages from people I don't care about with out a background and just a outline, right? So we style the initial messages, we then create a mutation observer, and anytime a change is detected, it styles the added nodes by passing in the mutations that it observed. Then we once again tell it, observe this element and anything that changes in the children, etc. Okay, so that takes care of that. Now let's take a look at that scroll to bottom method that I told you about earlier. It's literally just this.element.scrollTop equals this.element.scrollHeight, which is saying grab the distance from the scroll to the top and add it to the scroll element. So, or add it to the scroll height, which means you go from here and you get pushed all the way down here. It's going to do the same thing with this chat box, scroll bar, whatever. Now there's a couple things we have to do after that. We have this style existing messages method. For that, we just create it. We say this.element.querySelectorAll, which means we're grabbing all of the messages on the page. And then for each of those, we're calling this.styleMessage, which is a method we have to create. But first, let's create this styleAddedNodes method. We'll come down here. Let me save this so it formats. The styleAddedNodes takes in a set of mutations, iterates through each of them, and then for each of the added nodes, it checks if the node type is equal to 1. We just add this in. Node type of 1 is an element, e.g., then hopefully this will give me something like div, p tag, span, and then I'd like an h, etc. Right? Okay, so that's what a node type of 1 means. If we detect a change or a mutation with a node type of 1, we then want to style the message, which is the same thing we're doing right here with this style message. So hopefully you can see what the next thing we're going to cover is. That's right. Here's what a style message looks like. It takes in a node, it grabs the message node, which we have to create. And that message node we'll just do real quick. This is just a quick little return, the node closest message or a query selector for the message. So you might get something where like you add the delete button. It then needs to not style the delete button because that's a separate mutation. It just grabs the nearest message and it'll style that instead. Again, it's kind of weird because we're sending two broadcasts, but you get the idea. So we then say, all right, get the user ID, which we get from message node.dataset.userid, because remember, inside of our message, we set this user ID. We then have the user ID and the message body, so we can say this.applyStyle user ID message body. And the apply style is the final thing in here. That's right, you're almost free. We say apply style user ID message body. We check if the user ID is equal to this.current user ID value, which remember we're getting from this value up here, which we're getting from setting the actual user ID on the chat box itself. So we have access to the current user and the user that created the message. If the user that created the message is the same thing as the current user, we add these classes here. I don't actually think I have this one defined, but that's fine. Else we say message body.classlist.add border theme color main, and I don't think I'm actually using most of these, but some of these might be coming from like Tailwind or something. But that's effectively it. We've now set up the styling. Let's go ahead and let's test this. Let me do a bin/dev. I forgot to install Foreman, gem install Foreman. Let's do a bin/dev again. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's refresh this localhost port 3000 real quick, and then I'll hit Control-Shift-N and drag this one over to the side. I have to refresh a couple times because Brave is cringe. Let me come over to localhost port 3000 in here. All right, so for this one, I'll log in as dean@example.com and a password of password. That looks good. Let's go ahead and let's sign in as Joe. Let's do jane@doe.com and a password of password. Make sure I'm zoomed in to 150%. I am. Okay, so Dean has one message here. John has one message, or Jane has one message. Let me delete Jane's message. We can see that disappeared from both screens. So I can say, lol, you have no proof. I can send that. You can see this form gets cleared. This one gets styled because it's from Jane. Jane also gets a delete button. Dean does not see a delete button for that message, and this gets styled as if it was sent from someone else. You can see Jane's name appears there, and then Dean can reply. And you can see this works exactly how you would expect it to. All right, so that was four minutes faster than the dry run I did. But yeah, hopefully you found this interesting. Again, it doesn't look as good as this one, but I think it's important to remember that Rails does have a lot of these tools that you can leverage. And the more you create these weird side projects, do these speedruns or whatever, the more familiar you get with some of these patterns, where I've done this so many times now that it really doesn't take that long to set something like this up. And the nice thing is, because of how similar this is to like the chat room we've done in the past, you can, while you're doing this exercise, you can already see where you would have to change some things to like add chat rooms or deal with like a user online notifier. Like we did that activity notifier in the actual Rails chat room tutorial, where whenever a user was online, you'd see the green little bubble next to them. So it's definitely worth trying some of these things sometimes just to see, like, first of all, how long it takes you, because it does help you to estimate, like if you're working as a software dev and you need to estimate how long it'll take you to do something. If you're already using Rails and you see something like this, you get a better idea for it. Of course, if you're working in like a spaghetti code, ancient code base, you probably want to add like a multiplier to your time. It's not actually going to take you 30 minutes, but you get an idea where you're like, okay, well, the last time I said a username would take 10 minutes and it actually took me 3 days. I know here this will take me 30 minutes, so it'll probably take me like 2 weeks to get this done. And it does help you to sort of estimate those things because you already have the familiarity, you know what pitfalls you'll probably run into, and you know where the code base will try to betray you, etc. But yeah. Hope this was interesting. Hope this was entertaining, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.